Hello there, Josh Cohen.
Hi, Glenn. How are you today?
Doing fine. Welcome to the Glenn Show. Josh, Glenn Loury at Brown University and bloggingheads.tv.
And I'm Josh Cohen, Stanford University, Apple University, and Boston Review.
Josh, you saw the president's State of the Union address last night. So did I. Everybody's talking about it. So are we. That's our reason for being here today. What'd you think?
I thought it was pretty good. Good. That's a low resolution answer, but that's my low resolution answer is that it was pretty good. I guess I was struck by two things about the speech. Two things, but contrasting it with earlier Obama State of the Unions.
Okay.
The first is that, you could go back to 2009 and, it's this historic moment, first black president. But comes into office, the economy is in free fall, financial disaster. He's got two wars going, one of which he's, fully behind and ends up escalating, war in Afghanistan. So, there was all this sense of, promise, but this was not a great time to be coming into office. I sort of felt the first thing that I thought was different was that he gave the impression last night of somebody who thought that maybe he had a little bit of wind at his back. Not only did he win re-election in, what could have been a very tough election, but also, despite the fact that lots and lots of people are suffering from long-term unemployment, there is some improvement in the economy. Iraq is past history, and Afghanistan is winding down. So there was a guy who sort of felt like he was giving a speech that he might have given 4 years ago if the world hadn't been a disaster. The other thing is that, and this is something we've talked about before, there was a little bit less of this, hey, I'm just the voice of common sense here. There are good people, post-partisan, people ready to come together and do a bunch of shit that'll really improve things. There was there was more of a, he's got an agenda. He thinks the agenda is right. He's going to push to make it happen. And I think on the minimum wage, on the preschool, interesting preschool stuff, his strong affirmation on climate change, not to mention immigration and guns. This was, a little bit more closer to where, I think people were expecting him to be when he was originally elected. But then, so he wasn't trying, it wasn't all about post-partisanship. It was all about, he's got an agenda, he's prepared to do something about it. And I thought that was a good thing. So in two differences from the past, on the whole, I thought pretty good. What about you?
Well, I thought it was an effective speech. It was a muscular speech, I thought. I mean, it was, perhaps I'm saying something not unlike what you just said. It was partisan. It was political. It had a clear ideological kind of baseline that was running throughout all the improvisations and all of the particular little melodic things that he was doing to push this jazz analogy down underneath. It seemed to me there was this, we're all in this together. Government is a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. We want to do for the many and not for the few, this kind of idea. And it was very, well developed rhetorically, and I thought reflected in the laundry list, the necessary laundry list of substantive proposals that he trotted out. So I thought the president was in good form. It was, if you will, classic Obama. He was feeling his oats. He's not looking back anymore. He's gotten reelected. He's the master of the stage politically at the moment, and it showed in the speech. So, I'd have to give high marks on the speech as a speech. Some of these.
I was also.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you go, Josh. I'll wait.
I was just going to comment on something that we discussed last time. And a big theme in our last conversation was it's all middle class, middle class, middle class. There are a lot of poor people.
Yeah.
Where is that? And I thought when I listened to the speech last night, I thought, well, I guess Glenn and I were both wrong. Because even though it was framed as all being about the middle class and rebuilding the middle class, et cetera, the proposal on the minimum wage and the proposal on preschool are policies whose principal beneficiaries or significant beneficiaries are people who are in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. So I thought there was a little bit, there was more of an affirmative agenda about dealing with some issues about income inequality. Now, we got to be careful not to go too far. If the minimum, if Obama's minimum wage proposal is passed, unlikely though that is, but if it's passed, minimum wage will be back to where it was in the late 1960s, which means that if it's passed, in real terms, if it's passed, all of the productivity gains of the last, 40, 45 years are lost on people in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. I'm going to not exaggerate. Nevertheless, I thought, though the opening emphasis was on the middle class, I think this was a more expansive, there was some elements of a more expansive vision than that, and I thought that was good.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit, Josh. I think it's the economist in me, so I ask you and the audience forbearance, okay? The point you make that there was more in this speech that could be construed as promoting the interest of those at the bottom and not just the middle class. That's certainly true. Universal preschool education would be another one of those that one could point to that has that character. But I just have to say about the minimum wage, I know it's motherhood and apple pie. I know that organized labor has taught us that a higher minimum wage makes poor people better off. And I know that there is some evidence in the economics research literature to the effect that under some circumstances, raising the minimum wage may not have had too bad a deleterious effect on the employment options of low-skilled people. But I'm just telling you, it's not a panacea in my view, in my expert view. I think that it's a marginal anti-poverty policy at best, and it can backfire, and it can have unintended negative consequences. You're pricing low-skilled people, very low-skilled people, people whose labor is not worth $9 an hour to an employer. Somebody hiring somebody to wash the dishes in their restaurant, to change the linen in their hotel bedrooms, to stand by a simple machine in their manufacturing plant, to load or unload their trucking dock, and so forth and so on. People who think that employers, the labor isn't worth $9 an hour, you've just priced those low-skilled people out of the labor market. And I understand that if I'm making $22 an hour, I like that $9 an hour is the sort of floor above which I'm bargaining for my wage, because the higher that floor, the greater my bargaining power. But it's not at all clear to me that if I'm somebody whose labor, for whatever the reasons are, is only worth $7 an hour and I've now been priced out of the market, that I've been helped. If it were that easy, why don't we make the minimum wage $15 an hour? We could eliminate poverty. The president says, and others, no one who works full-time should be poor. Well, that's just too simple by half. Some people who work full-time are offering labor that isn't worth enough that by that work alone they would be out of poverty. But they might be just one of several members in a household. They might be a spouse whose partner is working and making a decent wage. They might be a teenage or young adult worker who dropped out of high school and is looking for menial and manual labor while they get their act together. So the link between the minimum wage and poverty is indirect. the efficacy of the minimum wage at actually helping low-skilled people is ambiguous, dubious in my mind. And this feels more like a slogan to me than it does like a policy. And that's just my view.
Yeah.
Just on the minimum wage. I'm not knocking the whole program. I'm just saying.
Yeah. And I know we're doing punditry here, but I'm not going to go in for the bullshit punditry of pretending to an expertise that I don't have on the literature on the minimum wage. It's not just there are a few people like the head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors.
Alan Kruger.
Alan Kruger, who's written on, and I'm not citing
supporting the minimum wage. It should be acknowledged, and I'm not trying to pull rank on you, Josh, by mentioning that I'm an economist, but I'm familiar with this literature. No. Yeah, okay.
You have expertise. And I don't. And I don't want. And I'm not going to. There's a debate. I've been saying
there's a debate, and it's a close question. It's not a clear thing either way. It's a close question about the employment effects of the minimum wage. Conservatives have argued for many years that the minimum wage undercuts employment at the bottom. Some more progressive writers, Alan Kruger among them, David Card at Berkeley and others, have produced evidence suggesting that, well, that might not be so in every case. And I'm just saying that based on my various, encounters with this literature and my own research over the years and so forth, I think it's a mixed bag, and it's just not. It's not a home run. It's not a slam dunk. It's just not obviously going to have the results. And as I say, it can have unintended consequences that can be deleterious. So that's all by way of saying it's not the answer to the poverty problem.
Let me just be clear on one thing here, which is the best thing for driving wages at the bottom of the income distribution would be if unemployment were not still so disastrously high. So tight labor markets would be really good, and if there were tight labor markets, that would probably have a more significant impact. Tight labor markets and some unions would do a lot more than increasing the minimum wage. Nevertheless, I think when we were talking, I referred to our previous conversation.
Indeed.
Our previous conversation, we said, it's all middle class. We were both complaining that it was all middle class. And all I'm saying is that I think, and maybe you disagree about this, I think the goal is not to increase the floor so that wages for people who are making $22 an hour are going to be driven up. But I think the goal is to try to find some policy instruments that plausibly have the effect, and it's not implausible, that plausibly have the effect of increasing the living standards for people at the bottom of the income distribution. And I think that was a surprise.
No, I got it.
It was a surprise, given our past. But the universal daycare is I think probably more significant, and it's another theme that we had talked about in our last conversation. I mean, we discussed Jim Heckman's views about the importance of early childhood interventions as an efficient and equitable way of improving circumstances for people in the bottom quintile. So you have a universal policy, but the principal beneficiaries of the policy are both the parents, who are lower down in the income distribution, and the kids of those parents. And that's what Jim has been arguing for 15 years. And we had that forum that we talked about in Boston Review with Heck. And so I thought that I was interested in that, surprised by it, pleased to hear it. Don't expect there to be much movement on it, but I thought it was a good thing. I also thought, the climate change, and I thought, the part of when Obama started talking about, holding his feet to the fire on drones, I had two reactions to that. First was I thought it was like airy abstractions. It was all kind of vague and, not going to really satisfy anybody who's concerned about what's been happening with drones. On the other hand, I thought to say, don't trust me. Don't trust me. We have to be held accountable on this. I thought that was a very important thing to say. I wish he was making better policy, but if you compare a statement like that, like don't trust me, hold us, we got to be transparent and we have to be held accountable, you compare that to strong assertions of executive privilege and executive authority. I thought that was a good thing in an otherwise almost vaporously abstract part of the speech.
I'm not following something here, Josh. I got to push back a little bit. What difference does it make if the commander-in-chief, who arrogates to himself the authority to execute anybody on the face of the earth whom he determines warrants that person comes out and says, well, there really should be somebody looking over my shoulder. I mean, aren't we still left with, those were just words. I mean, the actions, the legal rationale, the larger sort of strategic or tactical posture still has us arrogantly asserting the right to kill anybody anywhere on the planet, wherever they might be, whether we're at war with the country or not, simply based upon what intelligence is that we might have that they can't tell you about. I mean, that seems to be the problem, not the words that this particular president puts around the policy.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, with one exception. I think, to assert the basic principle of constitutional government, which is the principle that executive authority is going to be cabined and is not to be trusted, that I think is important. And I think it's different from what President Bush and Vice President Cheney and John Yoo said on this matter. So I don't like the policy. And I'm glad that I hope there are some deeds that are wrapped around the words and that there really is genuine accountability on it. But I think it makes a difference. It's made a difference for a few hundred years to people that, executive authority isn't supposed to be so independent. So if it's just words, then we're left with the same shitty policy that we've got now, the same arrogant assertion we've got now. I thought that in a part of the speech that was otherwise depressing and also incredibly vague about what exactly was being said, I thought there was an important principle that was reasserted, and it's not one that we were hearing from the previous administration. But asserting the principle, but then, just to come full circle, I agree, asserting the principle that this exercise of power is to be held accountable and actually living up to that, those are different matters. But I think the assertion of the principle was a good thing.
Okay. I'm not going to argue with you. I think that's more of a thin. I think it's less significant than you do, but I don't deny that it's a beneficial thing to have the principle asserted. But in any case, I want to talk about some of the other domestic initiatives. Okay, so guns. Okay, so Newtown massacre and other gun violence and gun victims in the hall, the theater of the people wearing the ribbons and memory of the victims of gun violence, and so on. Now, at one level, I am not a skeet shooter. I'm not a member of the National Rifle Association, and I don't own a firearm. Okay? And it makes perfectly good sense to me that some of the regulations that are being proposed, or restrictions, universal background check, limits on the capacity of magazines, the banning of certain kinds of weapons that seem mainly be designed for battlefield use and not for protecting yourself in civil society, I'm personally Glenn Loury. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I see that there's some political obstacles out there to doing all of that, but whatever. Still, my view is that if I look at what's going on in a place like Chicago, that's in the news now with all the murders and so forth, or more generally at the many thousands who die every year in the United States of gun violence, it's far from clear to me that any of that is going to make that much difference to the problem. And it feels a lot like symbolism. And while the moment is propitious for those who have been hounded to the margins of the political conversation by the National Rifle Association and others, it's propitious to push against them now because of recent events and so forth. It also feels to me like, the easiest, it's like the path of least resistance. I mean, this Chicago situation, this situation of urban violence and gangs and, streets of the big cities and the low-income neighborhoods and so forth, we're not even scratching the surface.